Morning light poured through the vast windows of the royal palace of Elara, but the light here was not ordinary sunlight. The palace walls were lined with crystalline panels that bent the rays of the twin suns into gentle ribbons of gold and silver, filling the hallways with a calm glow that felt almost alive. Outside, beyond the terraces and sky bridges, the enormous city stretched across the valley like a constellation that had fallen to the surface of the planet. Small aircraft drifted between towers, and far above them a ring of orbital stations glittered faintly in the atmosphere. Inside one quiet chamber overlooking the palace gardens, Elias sat at a curved table made of polished starstone. The table softly projected the pages of a book into the air between him and the young princess, seated across from him. The projection shimmered gently, the letters glowing in pale blue light. Princess Nora leaned forward with serious concentration. She looked almost entirely human, with the same soft features and curious eyes of a child her age. The only difference was her ears, long, elegant, and slightly pointed, curving gracefully backward through her silver blonde hair. At the moment those ears twitched every time she encountered a difficult word. She squinted at the floating text. Exp, 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 explorer, Elias said gently. Yes, Nora said with determination. Explorer. She cleared her throat and tried again. The brave explorer crossed the... She paused again and frowned. Galaxy. Galaxy, Elias confirmed. Nora nodded proudly as if she had just personally conquered 3 solar systems. Elias tried not to smile too much. Encouragement was important, but excessive celebration sometimes made students suspicious. Behind them, several members of the royal court stood silently near the walls. They pretended to observe the palace gardens, but Elias knew they were really watching the lesson. They had been watching every lesson for months. At first it had made him nervous. Teaching a small child was difficult enough without an audience of royal advisors and hovering security drones. The drones floated quietly near the ceiling now, their small lenses glowing faintly as they monitored the room. One of them rotated slightly as Nora stumbled over another word. Is the drone judging me? Nora whispered. Elias leaned slightly closer. Probably, he whispered back. They are very strict about pronunciation. Nora gasped softly and stared up at the drone with sudden seriousness. Then it should try reading this word, she muttered, pointing at the page. Elias coughed to hide a laugh. Nora returned to the sentence with renewed determination. The brave explorer crossed the galaxy to meet a new civilization. She finished the line and looked up triumphantly. Elias nodded. That was excellent. Nora studied the next sentence for a long moment. Then she tilted her head slightly. Teacher Elias? Yes? Did humans really travel across space in ships that needed coffee to function? Elias blinked. Ships do not technically require coffee, he said carefully. Nora waited. However, he added, the humans operating the ships absolutely do. Nora giggled. One of the advisors near the wall shifted slightly, as if unsure whether laughter during a royal education session was acceptable. Elias pretended not to notice. Nora continued reading, her voice growing more confident with each sentence. The words drifted slowly across the air between them, glowing softly. For a while the room was peaceful. Outside, the palace gardens shimmered with alien flowers that changed color with the movement of the wind. Small maintenance robots moved silently between the trees. Then Nora stopped reading. The floating text paused mid-sentence. Elias noticed the silence and looked up. Nora was staring at him, not with confusion or frustration the way she sometimes did when a lesson became difficult. This look was thoughtful, serious in a way that felt strangely older than her years. Her long ears twitched once. Then she slowly reached across the table. Her small hand gently closed around his. Elias blinked in surprise but did not pull away. Children sometimes sought reassurance during difficult moments, but Nora's expression remained calm. Very calm. She stood up from her chair. The movement drew the attention of everyone in the room. The advisors near the wall straightened. One of the hovering drones rotated again. Nora held Elias's hand tightly and turned toward the watching court. Her voice was clear. I want Teacher Elias to be my father. The words echoed softly through the chamber. For a moment, nothing moved. The advisors froze. The drone stopped drifting. Even the floating text projection flickered slightly as if confused. Elias sat completely still, holding the reading book in his other hand. His brain attempted to process the sentence it had just heard. Unfortunately, it seemed to be working very slowly. Across the chamber, one elderly court advisor inhaled sharply. Another dropped a ceremonial data tablet. The sound echoed like thunder in the sudden silence. Nora looked up at Elias with quiet certainty. "I thought about it for a long time," she said. Elias opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again. He had prepared himself for many possible teaching challenges. Unexpected vocabulary, difficult grammar, even the occasional question about how black holes worked. But he had absolutely not prepared for this. The silence lasted so long that Elias briefly wondered if the palace had some kind of emergency system that froze time whenever something socially catastrophic happened. He blinked once, twice. Princess Nora still held his hand. Across the chamber, the royal advisors remained perfectly still, as if someone had suddenly transformed them into decorative statues. Then the hovering security drone above them made a small mechanical noise. "Processing unexpected social declaration," the drone announced politely. That seemed to break the spell. 3 advisors began whispering at once. One of them dropped another tablet. A 4th advisor slowly sat down on a nearby bench as if his legs had forgotten how to work. Elias remained seated at the table, still holding the reading book. His brain had only reached the stage of repeating Nora's sentence internally. "I want Teacher Elias to be my father." Yes, that was definitely what she had said. He leaned down slightly toward Nora and spoke in the quietest voice he could manage. "Nora," he whispered carefully, "that is a very important sentence." Nora nodded seriously. "Yes." "Sometime," Elias continued gently, "important sentences cause important reactions." Nora looked around the room. Several advisors were now arguing in hushed panic. One of them had activated a small holographic legal archive that floated beside his head, rapidly displaying ancient documents. Another advisor was rubbing his forehead while whispering something that sounded suspiciously like a prayer. Nora looked back at Elias. "Did I pronounce it wrong?" she asked. Elias nearly laughed. "No," he said softly. "Your pronunciation was perfect." The drone above them rotated again. "Alert! Royal protocol deviation detected," it announced. "Oh, good," Elias muttered under his breath. "Now the robots are involved." Nora giggled. Across the room, one tall advisor with silver robes stepped forward, clearly attempting to restore order. "Princess Nora," he said carefully, "perhaps you would like to reconsider your statement." Nora tilted her head. "No." The advisor blinked. "Well," he said weakly, "that simplifies things." The holographic legal archive beside another advisor suddenly expanded, projecting a towering wall of glowing text into the air. Ancient alien symbols scrolled rapidly. The advisor gasped. "Oh, no!" Another advisor leaned closer. "Oh, yes? Oh, no," the first one repeated. "It's in the law." Several heads turned instantly. "In the law?" someone whispered. The advisor nodded nervously. "The heir's declaration of familial bond. Article 7. A murmur swept through the room. Elias quietly wished he had taken a class called Unexpected Royal Laws for Teachers before accepting this job. Unfortunately, the university had never offered such a course. The advisor cleared his throat. "According to succession law," he continued reluctantly, "if the royal heir formally identifies an individual as a parental figure, the declaration must be investigated by the crown." The words hung in the air like a slowly detonating star. Several advisors looked as though they might faint. One of the palace guards near the door quietly whispered to another guard. "I knew this week would be interesting." Elias raised a hand slightly. "Excuse me," he said carefully. The room went silent again. Everyone turned toward him. Elias immediately regretted speaking. Being the center of attention in a royal palace during a legal crisis was not part of his long-term career plan. He cleared his throat. "I just want to confirm something," he said. "Is this situation normal?" 20 advisors stared at him. One of them coughed. "No." "Ah," Elias said. That is a very accurate answer, another advisor added. Nora squeezed Elias's hand again. I told you it was important, she said proudly. Elias looked down at her. That you did. A faint humming sound echoed through the palace corridors beyond the chamber. Several advisors suddenly straightened. The guards at the doors stood at attention. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. Elias noticed it immediately. Something or someone important was approaching. One of the advisors whispered urgently, "The Queen." Another advisor quickly deactivated the holographic law archive. Too late. The tall doors at the far end of the chamber opened smoothly. Queen Kyra entered. She moved with quiet authority, her presence immediately filling the room with a calm but powerful gravity. Her long ears curved elegantly through her dark hair, and her expression was composed in the way only rulers who had faced difficult years could manage. Her eyes moved across the chamber once. She saw the advisors, the drones, the scattered tablets. Then her gaze settled on Nora and Elias, and their joined hands. The Queen stopped walking. For a moment she simply studied the scene. Then she spoke. "What?" she asked calmly. "Has happened here?" No one answered. The advisors seemed to have collectively forgotten how language worked. Finally, Nora raised her free hand slightly. "I told everyone something," she said. Queen Kara looked at her daughter. "And what did you tell them?" Nora smiled. "That I want teacher Elias to be my father." Silence returned. Queen Kyra did not move. Her expression did not change, but something in her eyes froze completely. Behind her, one advisor quietly whispered to another, "She hasn't spoken about her father in 2 years." The Queen heard that. Elias could see it in the faint shift of her gaze. For several long seconds she looked at Nora. Then she looked at Elias. Not angrily, not accusingly, just studying him. Elias felt like a specimen under a very powerful microscope. He lifted one hand in a small, helpless gesture. "I was explaining vocabulary," he said quietly. Nora nodded helpfully. "He's very good at it." Somewhere in the back of the room, a guard tried and failed to suppress a laugh. The Queen finally stepped closer. She knelt slightly in front of Nora. "Nora," she said gently, "why did you say this?" Nora answered without hesitation. "Because he makes the palace feel safe again." The room became completely still. Elias did not know what to say. Queen Kyra slowly stood again. Her gaze moved across the advisors, then back to Elias. The silence stretched. Finally, she spoke. "Then we will examine this carefully." Every advisor inhaled sharply. The Queen's voice remained calm. "According to the law." The moment the Queen finished speaking, the entire room seemed to inhale at the same time. Not loudly, not dramatically, just the quiet collective breath of several dozen people realizing that something very complicated had just become official. Elias was still holding the reading book. It now felt like the most ridiculous object in the galaxy. Queen Kyra turned toward the assembled advisors, her voice calm and precise. "Article 7, she said. Immediately, 3 advisors activated their legal tablets again. Holographic documents unfolded into the air like glowing wings. One elderly advisor adjusted his glasses and began reading nervously. "According to the Succession Stability Charter, if the heir declares a parental bond with an individual—" "Yes," another advisor interrupted. "We know that part." The first advisor cleared his throat. "The Crown must conduct a formal evaluation of the individual's suitability to serve as a parental figure to the heir." The word evaluation floated through the room like a slow-moving asteroid. Several advisors immediately began whispering again. One of them muttered, "We have never evaluated a teacher before." Another replied, "We once evaluated a pirate captain." "That was during the war." "Yes, but he had excellent references." Elias slowly raised his hand. Everyone turned toward him again. He lowered it halfway, then raised it again. "Question," he said cautiously. The Queen regarded him with quiet curiosity. "Yes?" Elias gestured slightly toward the glowing legal documents floating above the advisors. "When the law says evaluation, does it mean like a job interview?" The advisors looked horrified. One of them whispered, "It is much worse than that." Elias nodded slowly. "I suspected that might be the case." Princess Nora was still holding his hand. She looked around the room with mild confusion. "Why is everyone so dramatic?" she asked. One advisor looked personally attacked by that question. Another advisor leaned toward the Queen and spoke carefully. "Your Majesty, perhaps the tutor should be escorted to a secure chamber while we review the procedure." Elias blinked. "Secure chamber?" The advisor quickly corrected himself. "Comfortable, secure chamber." "That does not improve the phrase," Elias said quietly. Nora tugged on his sleeve. "He has to stay," she said firmly. The advisors exchanged worried glances. Queen Kyra remained silent for several seconds, studying Elias carefully. He tried to sit as normally as possible, which was surprisingly difficult, while 20 royal officials were analyzing him like a newly discovered alien species. One advisor stepped closer to the Queen. "Your Majesty, the law is clear. The heir's declaration must be investigated immediately." "Yes," another advisor added nervously. "The court will demand a response." The Queen's gaze shifted slightly. "Let them demand," she said calmly. The advisors fell silent. Then she looked back at Elias. "What is your profession?" Elias hesitated. "I teach children how to read." The Queen waited. "That is the entire job," Elias added. Several advisors looked disappointed. One of them had clearly been hoping for something more heroic. Princess Nora spoke again. "He also tells good jokes." Elias rubbed his forehead. "I feel that might not help my case." One of the hovering drones drifted slightly lower and projected a scanning beam across Elias. "Biometric analysis initiated," the drone announced. Elias looked up. "Oh, good," he said. "Now the machines are judging me too." The drone beeped politely. "Subject appears calm under extreme social stress." "That is because I am still confused," Elias replied. Nora giggled. Across the room, two advisors were quietly arguing. This situation could destabilize the court. It could also strengthen diplomatic ties with humans. "We are not discussing diplomacy. We are discussing the heir's emotional stability." "That is much worse." Elias tried to follow the conversation but gave up after the phrase "interstellar parental precedent" appeared. Queen Kyra stepped forward slightly. The room fell silent again. Her eyes rested on Elias. "You arrived on Althera 8 months ago." "Yes." "You previously worked in frontier education systems." "Yes." "You declined a higher academic position to teach children in remote colonies." Elias blinked. "That information was surprisingly easy for you to find." "We are very thorough." "I can see that." The Queen folded her hands behind her back. "Why did you accept the tutoring position here?" Elias considered the question. Then he shrugged slightly. "The same reason I accept most teaching jobs." The Queen waited. "Someone needed a teacher," he said. Several advisors exchanged quiet looks. It was not the ambitious answer they expected. Nora looked proud. "See?" she said. One advisor sighed softly. "This is going to be complicated." Another advisor muttered, "The court will panic." A third advisor whispered, "The historians are going to love this." Elias leaned slightly toward Nora. "Out of curiosity," he whispered, "did you plan any of this?" Nora shook her head. "I just said what was true." Elias nodded slowly. "That tends to cause the biggest problems." The Queen's voice cut gently through the murmurs. "The tutor will remain in the palace." Several advisors froze. "But," she continued calmly, "an investigation will begin immediately." More whispering erupted. Elias looked toward the ceiling. "Well," he murmured, "that sounds ominous." The drone above him responded helpfully. "Investigation procedures are typically thorough, but non-lethal." Elias stared at it. "Thank you for the reassurance." Nora squeezed his hand again. "Don't worry," she said. "You'll pass." Elias sighed softly. "I hope the test is not about royal law." Across the room, the advisors were already activating more legal archives. Holographic documents filled the chamber. One advisor looked at the others and whispered dramatically, "We may need the historical archives." Another advisor nodded gravely. "Possibly the ancient ones." Elias slowly leaned back in his chair. "This started as a reading lesson," he said quietly. Nora smiled. "It's still a reading lesson." Elias looked at the glowing legal documents surrounding them. I think the reading level just increased. By the next morning, the palace had changed in a subtle but unmistakable way. Nothing looked different at first glance. The same floating lights drifted through the hallways. The same polished corridors reflected the pale glow of the twin suns. And the same quiet palace drones hovered near the ceilings, like extremely polite insects. But the atmosphere had shifted. People were whispering. A lot. Elias noticed it immediately as he walked toward the lesson chamber, carrying Nora's reading tablet. Two palace guards standing near the corridor stopped talking the moment he approached. They both smiled, too politely. Elias walked past them. Behind him, one guard whispered, "That's him." The other whispered back, "The teacher?" "Yes." Elias sighed quietly. This was going to be a long day. When he entered the lesson chamber, Princess Nora was already there, sitting at the table with her legs swinging happily beneath the chair. "Good morning," she said brightly. "Good morning," Elias replied. Nora leaned forward conspiratorially. "Everyone is staring at you." "Yes," Elias said calmly. "I have also noticed that." A small hovering drone drifted closer to the table. "Observation continues," the drone announced. Elias pointed at it. "You see? Even the machines are gossiping." Nora giggled. The floating reading text appeared above the table again, glowing softly. The sentence from yesterday's unfinished lesson still hung in the air. Nora read it aloud. "The explorer discovered a new world and realized that everything had changed." She paused. "That sentence feels suspicious now," Elias muttered. Nora smiled. "You're the explorer." "I would have preferred discovering treasure," Elias replied. "Instead, you discovered politics." "That is definitely worse." Behind them, the chamber doors opened quietly. 4 royal advisors entered. Elias recognized them from yesterday. They carried several floating tablets and one large projection device that hummed softly with blue energy. Nora watched them with curiosity. "Are they here for the evaluation?" One advisor nodded. "Yes, Your Highness." Elias rubbed his forehead. "Do I get a warning before the difficult questions begin?" Another advisor activated the projection device. A holographic screen expanded across the room, displaying dozens of documents, diagrams, and psychological charts. "This is merely the preliminary phase," the advisor said. "That phrase is extremely frightening," Elias replied. The advisors ignored that. One stepped forward. "Teacher Elias, we will begin with a simple review of your personal history." "Excellent," Elias said. "I remember most of it." The advisor tapped the tablet. "You were born on the human colony world Helion 3. "Yes." "You worked for several frontier education networks." "Yes." "You declined multiple promotions in order to remain a classroom teacher." "Yes." The advisor looked up. "Why?" Elias shrugged. "I like classrooms." Another advisor frowned slightly. "That is not a strategic career decision." "It is a peaceful one," Elias said. Nora raised her hand suddenly. "Yes?" the advisor asked. "He also makes very good grilled sandwiches," she said. The advisors blinked. "That is not relevant," one of them said. "It should be," Nora insisted. "Good food is important for emotional health." Elias nodded solemnly. "I support this scientific claim." One advisor quietly typed something into his tablet. "Subject appears capable of maintaining positive emotional environment," he murmured. Elias leaned toward Nora. "You may have just improved my official evaluation." Nora looked proud. Another advisor stepped forward. "Next question. Have you ever held a position of political authority?" "No." "Military command?" "No." "Diplomatic leadership?" "No." The advisor paused. "Royal experience?" Elias looked around the palace chamber. "I am currently gaining some." Nora laughed loudly. Even one of the advisors struggled not to smile. Another drone drifted lower, projecting a faint scanning beam across Elias again. "Stress levels stable," it reported. "That is because I stopped understanding the situation yesterday," Elias replied. The advisors began quietly discussing something among themselves. "He shows consistent honesty." "Yes, possibly excessive honesty." "That may actually help." Elias watched them whispering. "This feels exactly like being a student again," he said to Nora. "Are you nervous?" "A little." Nora squeezed his hand reassuringly. "You'll pass." Across the room, another advisor activated a different holographic display. This one showed a series of psychological patterns and emotional response graphs. Elias stared at it. Those look very official. They are, the advisor said. What do they measure? Emotional stability under social pressure. Elias nodded slowly. So, yesterday? Yes. Nora leaned closer to Elias. Did you pass yesterday? I have no idea, Elias admitted. The chamber doors opened again. Everyone turned. Queen Kyra stepped inside. The advisors immediately straightened. The queen walked slowly toward the table, her gaze moving from the floating evaluation screens to Elias. And how is the investigation progressing? She asked calmly. One advisor answered quickly. Preliminary results indicate that the tutor demonstrates strong emotional stability, honesty, and positive influence on the heir. Another advisor added, he also appears incapable of lying convincingly. Elias raised a finger. That last one feels slightly insulting. Nora smiled up at her mother. See? I chose well. Queen Kara looked at Elias thoughtfully. He felt that same strange sensation again, the feeling of being carefully studied. Finally, she spoke. This investigation will continue. Several advisors nodded seriously. Elias sighed softly. Well, he said, at least today's lesson is more interesting than grammar. Nora grinned. I told you learning could be exciting. The investigation did not end after the first round of questions. If anything, it became stranger. Elias discovered that the palace had an entire department dedicated to something called holistic character evaluation. The name sounded friendly. The process was not. The next morning, he was escorted into a circular chamber filled with softly glowing panels and several hovering machines that looked far too interested in him. One of the advisors gestured toward a chair in the center of the room. Please sit. Elias sat. The chair quietly adjusted itself to his height, posture, and apparently his emotional state. That is unsettling, Elias said. It is adaptive furniture, the advisor replied. I preferred furniture when it did not adapt, Elias muttered. Princess Nora sat nearby, swinging her legs happily. She had insisted on observing the evaluation, and the queen had allowed it, though several advisors still looked nervous about that decision. A hovering sphere floated down toward Elias. Cognitive empathy scan beginning, it said. Elias looked at Nora. I think the robot is about to read my mind. Nora leaned closer to the sphere. Please be nice to him, she told it. The sphere paused. Instruction acknowledged. One advisor cleared his throat. We will now begin scenario analysis. That sounds harmless, Elias said cautiously. The holographic panels around the chamber lit up. A three-dimensional scene appeared in the air, a simulated city street with hovering vehicles and distant starships passing overhead. Scenario 1, the advisor said. A young citizen is lost in a crowded transit station. What do you do? Elias blinked. I help them find their parents. Please elaborate. I asked their name. The advisor waited. And then? I help them find their parents. The advisors exchanged looks. One of them typed something. Response demonstrates direct problem solving. Elias leaned toward Nora. I suspect they wanted a more dramatic answer. Nora whispered back, you should have added a laser battle. That felt unnecessary. The hologram changed. Now it showed a damaged spacecraft drifting through space. Scenario 2, the advisor continued. A civilian transport ship has lost navigation control. You are the nearest responsible authority. Elias frowned. I am a teacher. In the scenario, you are the nearest responsible authority. That seems like a design flaw. Nora laughed. Elias studied the drifting ship in the hologram. I contact professional pilots, he said. The advisor tilted his head. You would not attempt repairs yourself? I once tried to fix a toaster, Elias said calmly. The toaster won. Nora nearly fell out of her chair laughing. Another advisor quietly typed again. Subject demonstrates awareness of personal limitations. Elias pointed at the tablet. That sounds like praise. It is. The hologram shifted again. Now it displayed a palace corridor filled with arguing officials. Scenario 3, the advisor said carefully. You are present during a high-level political disagreement between nobles. Elias stared at the hologram. I leave. The advisor paused. You leave? Yes. Why? I am a teacher. That does not answer the question. Elias folded his arms. Political arguments between nobles are historically dangerous for nearby teachers. Several advisors looked uncomfortable. One whispered, "He is not wrong." Nora leaned toward Elias. "You're doing very well." "I am surviving," Elias replied. The evaluation continued for nearly an hour. More simulations appeared. Diplomatic misunderstandings, lost starship crews, malfunctioning agricultural satellites, even a bizarre situation involving a confused alien animal wandering into a city. Elias handled each scenario with the same calm practicality. Sometimes he solved the problem. Sometimes he admitted he would ask someone more qualified. The advisors wrote notes constantly. Eventually, the floating screens dimmed. The room grew quiet. One advisor studied his tablet. "Interesting." Another nodded. "Very interesting." Elias looked at Nora. "That word worries me." The advisors gathered together, whispering. Emotional stability confirmed. Yes. Consistent honesty. High empathy indicators. Low ambition for power. That one may be the most unusual. Finally, the lead advisor turned toward Elias. "Teacher Elias, your responses show a strong instinct toward protection and responsibility." Elias shrugged. "That is most of teaching." Nora looked proud again. "I told you." The chamber doors opened softly. Queen Kyra entered. The advisors immediately straightened. She walked slowly toward the center of the room, her gaze moving across the evaluation reports. "Well?" she asked. The lead advisor hesitated only briefly. "The tutor's psychological profile indicates unusual reliability." "Unusual?" the Queen asked. "He consistently chooses the safest and most compassionate outcome." Another advisor added, "And he refuses to pretend he knows things he does not." Elias nodded. "That policy has kept me alive." Nora ran up to her mother. "He's doing great." Queen Kyra looked at Elias for several long seconds. The quiet weight of her attention filled the chamber. Then she spoke calmly. "The investigation will continue." Elias sighed softly. "Of course it will." Nora took his hand again. "You'll pass the next one too." Elias looked at the advisors preparing another set of holographic devices. "I hope the next test does not involve piloting a spaceship." One advisor glanced at his tablet. "About that." Elias closed his eyes briefly. Oh no. By the time the sixth phase of the investigation began, Elias had developed a very specific routine. First, he woke up in the guest chamber the palace had assigned to him. The room was large enough to host a small conference and had a window overlooking half the capital city. Every morning he stared out at the flying traffic in the distant orbital ring and reminded himself that he had originally come here to teach a child how to read. Then he drank coffee. A lot of coffee. The palace machines had quickly learned that the human tutor required what the drones politely described as high caffeine maintenance. A small service robot now delivered a cup every morning without being asked. On this particular morning, the robot rolled into the room and placed the cup on the table. "Your emotional stability beverage," it announced. "Thank you," Elias said. He took a sip and sighed. "Today feels dangerous." The robot beeped. "Investigation Phase 6 scheduled in 30 minutes. "Yes," Elias muttered. "That is exactly what I meant." When he entered the evaluation chamber, he immediately noticed something different. There were fewer advisors. That should have been reassuring. It was not. Princess Nora was already there, sitting on the edge of the table, kicking her feet lightly. She waved enthusiastically when she saw him. "Good morning." "Good morning," Elias said. He looked around the room. "Where are the other 20 advisors?" Nora grinned. "Mother is doing the evaluation today." Elias paused. "Oh." He looked toward the far side of the chamber. Queen Kyra stood near one of the large observation windows, her back partially turned as she studied the distant skyline. When she heard them enter, she turned slowly. "Teacher Elias," she said calmly. "Your Majesty." The advisors present stepped back slightly, clearly aware that this evaluation would be different. Queen Kyra gestured toward the chair in the center of the room. "Please sit." Elias sat. He felt strangely calmer than before. After several days of tests involving drones, holographic disasters, and philosophical questions about alien wildlife management, One more evaluation seemed almost normal. The Queen walked slowly around the chamber. You have answered the advisor's questions with remarkable consistency. I try to be consistent, Elias said. That is unusual in politics. I am not a politician. Yes, she said quietly. That is becoming clear. Nora slid down from the table and wandered closer. Queen Kyra continued. You have shown patience with my daughter. That is not difficult. She can be energetic. Elias smiled slightly. Energetic is a good word. Nora crossed her arms. I heard that. The Queen's eyes softened briefly before returning to Elias. You understand the implications of her declaration? Yes. And you understand that the court is concerned? Yes. And you understand that this situation could change the future of the royal house? Elias nodded slowly. Yes. The Queen stopped walking. Yet you have not once attempted to influence Nora's decision? Elias shrugged. She already made the decision. That is true. Nora tugged on Elias's sleeve. Tell her the joke. Elias blinked. Which joke? The asteroid one. Queen Kyra raised an eyebrow. I am curious now. Elias sighed quietly. Well, he said, there was once an asteroid miner who said his job was very relaxing. Nora grinned. Why? Because whenever something went wrong, Elias said, it was always someone else's fault, millions of kilometers away. Nora laughed loudly. One of the advisors near the wall tried very hard not to smile. Queen Kyra studied Elias for a long moment. You use humor frequently. Yes. Why? Elias considered the question carefully. Because people breathe easier when they laugh. The Queen did not answer immediately. Instead, she turned slightly toward Nora. Why did you choose him? Nora did not hesitate. Because he doesn't pretend. The room became quiet. Nora continued in a softer voice. Everyone else in the palace talks carefully. They use long sentences and complicated words. She looked at Elias. He just tells the truth. Queen Kyra's expression shifted slightly. Truth can be dangerous. Elias nodded. Yes. And yet you still speak it. I am a teacher, Elias said. Children notice when adults lie. Nora squeezed his hand again. Queen Kyra looked out the window for several seconds, watching a line of cargo ships drifting through the sky. Finally, she spoke again. You know nothing about ruling. That is correct. You know nothing about court politics. That is also correct. You have never commanded armies or negotiated treaties. I once negotiated bedtime with 20 children, Elias said. Nora laughed. That is harder. Even one of the advisors chuckled quietly. Queen Kyra looked back at Elias. You are aware that the court believes this situation is extremely dangerous. Yes. And yet you remain calm. Elias thought about that. I am not calm, he said honestly. The Queen waited. I am simply focused on Nora. Nora smiled again. The Queen watched them both carefully. Then she nodded once. This phase of the evaluation is complete. Elias leaned back slightly in the chair. That was less terrifying than I expected, Nora whispered to him. That means you passed. Across the room, one advisor quietly checked his tablet. The final court review will be tomorrow. Elias sighed. Of course it will. Nora squeezed his hand again. Don't worry, she said. Elias smiled faintly. I am beginning to suspect that you planned this entire investigation. The great hall of the palace had not been this full in years. Light from the twin suns streamed through the towering windows, scattering across the polished floor like liquid gold. Rows of nobles, advisors, commanders, and diplomats filled the chamber. Even the hovering drones seemed unusually quiet as they drifted near the ceiling, recording the proceedings. Elias stood at the center of the hall beside Princess Nora. He had taught lessons in noisy frontier classrooms, aboard small colony stations, even once inside a cargo hangar during a meteor storm. But none of those situations had involved several hundred powerful alien officials staring at him as if he were an unusual scientific discovery. Nora held his hand calmly. You're doing fine, she whispered. I haven't done anything yet, Elias whispered back. That helps. At the far end of the hall, Queen Kyra stood before the royal dais, speaking quietly with the council of advisors. Several holographic documents floated beside them, glowing softly with the ancient legal texts that had been discussed endlessly over the past days. One advisor leaned toward another and whispered, "This will be recorded in the Royal Archives." Another replied, "Historians are already celebrating." Elias leaned toward Nora. "If historians are excited," he murmured, "that usually means something complicated is happening." Nora giggled. A ceremonial chime echoed through the hall. The murmurs faded instantly. Queen Kyra stepped forward. Her voice carried across the chamber with calm authority. "The investigation concerning the declaration of the royal heir has concluded." Every noble in the room leaned forward slightly. Elias resisted the urge to hide behind the nearest pillar. The queen continued, "The tutors, advisors, intelligence officials, and evaluation systems of this palace have spent several days studying Teacher Elias." Several advisors nodded solemnly. One of them whispered to another, "The drone reports alone were 40 pages." Elias blinked. 40? Nora whispered. "You're very interesting." Queen Kara's gaze moved across the assembled court. "The results of this investigation are unusual." That was not a reassuring word. Elias felt Nora squeeze his hand again. "Teacher Elias demonstrates honesty, emotional stability, compassion, and a consistent refusal to seek power." Several nobles exchanged surprised looks. One of them muttered, "That last one is rare." The queen continued, "He has shown patience with the heir, and he has restored laughter to this palace." For a moment the hall grew quieter. Everyone knew what that meant. 2 years earlier, the palace had lost its king. Since then, the halls had grown quieter, heavier. Nora looked up at her mother. Queen Kyra paused before speaking again. "The law requires that the voice of the heir be respected." A ripple moved through the court. Some nobles looked uneasy. Others looked thoughtful. The queen raised one hand. "However, the law does not force the crown to rush a decision that will shape the future of the realm." Elias felt several hundred eyes turn toward him again. He whispered to Nora, "This feels like the part where I faint." Nora shook her head. "Not yet." Queen Kara stepped down from the dais. She walked slowly across the hall until she stood directly in front of Elias and Nora. For a moment she said nothing. Then she spoke quietly enough that only those nearby could hear. "You have caused an extraordinary disturbance in my palace, Teacher Elias." Elias nodded. "That was not my intention." "I believe you." She looked down at Nora. "You truly wish this?" Nora nodded firmly. "Yes." The queen studied her daughter's face for a long moment. Then she looked back at Elias. "You have changed something here." Elias frowned slightly. "I only taught reading." "You taught more than that." She glanced around the hall. "For 2 years this palace has been silent." Nora squeezed Elias's hand. Queen Kyra continued softly. "My daughter stopped speaking about her father. The court learned to avoid the subject. Even laughter disappeared from these halls." She paused. Then a teacher arrived. Elias did not know what to say. The queen straightened slightly and addressed the court again. "Teacher Elias will remain in this palace." A murmur passed through the nobles. "As tutor to the heir," she continued, "and as a guardian trusted by the crown." Several advisors nodded approvingly. One noble whispered, "A careful decision." Another whispered back, "A wise one." The queen turned again toward Elias. "The future will decide what other roles you may hold." Elias exhaled slowly. "That sounds manageable." Nora beamed. "I told you." Queen Kyra's expression softened slightly. "Princess Nora's declaration will not be ignored." She looked down at her daughter. "But some bonds grow best with time." Nora thought about that. Then she nodded. "That's okay." She looked up at Elias again. "You're still staying?" "Yes," Elias said. "That's what matters." The tension in the hall slowly dissolved. Several nobles began speaking again. One advisor whispered dramatically, "The archives will require an entire new section." Another advisor replied, "Title it, The Incident of the Tutor." Elias leaned toward Nora. "I feel like I accidentally started a historical event." Nora smiled. "You did." Queen Kyra watched them both for a moment. Then she turned back toward the court. Proceedings concluded. The ceremonial chime sounded again. The nobles slowly began leaving the hall. Above them, the palace drones resumed their quiet drifting. Elias looked down at Nora. "Well," he said, "we still have a reading lesson scheduled." Nora grinned. "Good." She picked up the floating book projection from earlier in the week. The sentence appeared again in glowing blue text. The explorer discovered a new world and realized everything had changed. Elias read it silently. Then he smiled. "Yes," he said softly. "I think that part is accurate.